everybody! For those of you that don't know me, my name is Rachel Swenson, and I am a member of the Cormier Honors College here at Longwood University. For Dr. Feather's SPED 389 class, I had to do an honors enhancement project in order to satisfy my honors requirements for this year. Dr. Feathers and I agreed on me writing a guidebook on how to adapt and accommodate your classroom for students with IEPs. And today I'm going to share my book with you and talk a little bit about it. Dr. Feather should have uploaded a link to it for you guys to view. And I just hope that you guys get as much out of it as I did. So I have a copy of it here and I'm just gonna go through it and talk a little bit about it for you guys. And if you have any questions, please feel free to message me or ask me about them. But the title of my guidebook was How to Adapt and Collaborate Your Classroom for Students with IEPs, a guidebook on everything I learned from SPED 389. So I just introduced the book and explained that the purpose of the book is to help pre-service teachers and future teachers like myself learn how to collaborate and accommodate in a general education classroom for students with IEPs, because it's going to happen and we're going to have to do it. So we might as well learn about it. So the first thing that I talked about is the disabilities that you can encounter in a general education classroom. There are lots of different disabilities that could possibly come up, and I went ahead and I talked about what they were, what they meant, and the different characteristics, so you as a teacher know what to look for in your student and know what to expect if you're told you have a student with an IEP that has a disability. You'll know how to accommodate for them, what you can do for them even before the first day they set foot into your classroom. The first disability that I talked about was intellectual disabilities. Intellectual disabilities are disabilities that reflect a significant limitation in overall cognitive ability. Some of the characteristics are difficulty paying attention, short-term memory deficits, academic deficits, lack of motivation. The next is learning disabilities or specific learning disabilities, and those refer to a discrepancy between an individual's ability and achievement in one or more cognitive areas of function, such as speech, written language, math, reading, etc. Next is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, which is a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity/impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. Next is emotional or behavioral disorders. So there's no universal definition of what an emotional or behavioral disorder is, but it's kind of that people with these disorders tend to feel and act in extreme ways that are well outside of social norms. So extreme aggression, extreme depression, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, things like that. Next is autism spectrum disorder, and the American Psychiatric Association has a very long definition for what autism spectrum disorder is, but I just kind of summed it up saying that an individual with ASD exhibits persistent social deficits and restrictive repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Speech and language impairments are the next disability category that I discussed, and speech and language impairments are just difficulty communicating and or understanding spoken and oral language. Hearing impairments is next, which is just an individual that has difficulty or lacks the ability to take in and process auditory information. Visual impairments are a disability that makes the individual have difficulty seeing or processing visual information. They might not be able to see at all, which would be blindness. The final category is physical and health disabilities and other low incidence disabilities is the category. And there are many different types of physical abilities. There are three main categories, which are orthopedic impairments, multiple disabilities, or traumatic brain injuries. And then health disabilities just refer to other health impairments such as asthma. And once I talked about all of the characteristics of those disabilities and what you could expect to see in your classroom, the next thing I did was talk about how to teach these students. So I explained what an IEP is. An IEP is an acronym that stands for Individualized Education Program. And the definition that I used was an individualized education program is a part of an overall strategy designed to deliver services appropriate to the individual needs of a pupil age 3 and older. So an individualized education program is just a specific legal document that is created by a team of individuals that have the child's best interest in mind, and they set goals for the students to progress throughout the year or over the course of several years. And then I talked about all the different types of accommodations and adaptations we can make within the classroom. The first type of accommodation I talked about was physical and environmental manipulations. And some examples of that are seating arrangements. You may have preferential seating for students who have attention deficit disorders or behavioral issues, or you may specifically have students sit in the front next to peers who exhibit on-task behaviors. The next one is classroom layout, where you might talk about you have wider aisles, or you may have more space between your desks or something like that to ensure that you can accommodate for students that might have wheelchairs or crutches, or possibly students with visual impairments may need that extra space because they have a cane. The next is adaptive seating that you may use for like students with wheelchairs. You might have specialized seats just for these students. And the final environmental manipulation that I spoke about was sensory stations. So anywhere in your room, you can set up a little station, a little corner that has anything you can imagine to feed your students sensory diets. So this could include soft music, dim lights, blankets for them to touch, Play-Doh, fidget spinners, things for them to manipulate in their hands, weighted blankets for that added comfort. It could include, maracas and tambourines just to make that little noise and get their jitters out. Anything that you think would benefit your students, you can include in a sensory station. And it's all up to your classroom and how your students handle things. The next type of manipulation I talked about was academic differentiation. And several of the examples I used were chunking up lessons into smaller pieces for your students who have trouble paying attention or sitting still for long periods of time. You separate their lesson into segments and give them little small breaks between each segment so they can regroup and come back to the lesson. The next is cut a deal, which is one we learned from Dr. Feathers herself, where you might take, it's like a form of chunking. You might take like a long assignment where they have 20 math questions and they start getting frustrated around question 5 or question 10. So you tell them, all right, let's cut a deal. You complete 5 more questions and I'll cut off the last 5. And then instead of completing 20 questions, they only did 15 and they feel like they made a deal with you and they get a little less frustrated because it's a lot more manageable. The next one is Paula Brown, which was a reading strategy that we discussed in class, where you go through and you separate each paragraph into its own little section, and you use that as a reading strategy when you're answering your comprehension questions. At the end, you go back and you find the answer, you highlight the answer in the text, you write where you found the answer in the text. That way you are practicing your comprehension strategies. And then I also talked about assistive technologies that you might use in your classroom. So some examples of assistive technologies you might use could range anywhere from a pencil grip to Braille for students with visual disabilities. You might have wheelchairs, walkers, eye gaze technology. You might have specialists in your classroom, speech specialists, language specialists, physical therapists. Anything like that is an assistive technology for your students, because assistive technology is anything that the student can use to better their education. Verbal directions is the next thing. So for students that have difficulty reading or students that have visual impairments, you might have to speak the directions that you're giving to the class out loud in order to make sure everybody can comprehend and understand what the rules of the task are. And small groups is the next thing I talked about. Some students work better in smaller groups of people. Sometimes being around large groups of people is intimidating, such as students with autism spectrum disorder. They tend to be intimidated in larger groups. And the final thing I talked about were testing accommodations that you might need to make for your students with IEPs. So you might need to give them longer time. They may need to go to a completely separate room and work in a quiet space in a different environment. They may need to use a computer to read the questions out loud. They may need a proctor. Anything. They might need someone to help them record the answers if they have difficulty gripping things. They might need the test in larger print. They might need it in Braille. Anything like that is a testing accommodation that you could make for a student with an IEP. The next thing I talked about was how academic differentiation looks in your classroom, and I gave an example in each subject. So I gave an example for reading, social studies, science, and math, and you guys can go through and look at those and And then the next thing I talked about was collaboration. There are so many individuals that you will collaborate with. If you have a student with an IEP, especially depending on the severity of the disability, and I listed some people that you may work with, which are speech and language specialists, math specialists, reading specialists, special educators, interpreters, physical educators. These are all people that you may have to collaborate with and work with to make sure that your child gets the best experience. Cooperative teaching is the next thing that I discussed in my guidebook. Now, we learned the different co-teaching models in class, but I'll just go through them real quick. One is one teach, one observe, where the one teacher is teaching to the whole class and the other teacher, usually the specialist, is standing back and observing. The next is one teach, one assist, where one teacher is teaching and the second teacher is walking around and helping the students that need help, specifically the students with the IEPs. They might need to give them a little extra assistance. The next is parallel teaching, where you split the class in half and give the student to teacher ratio is a smaller number. And the teacher and the specialist both teach the same lesson to just a smaller group of students. Station teaching is when you have different stations and your class rotates to each section and they're doing a different part of the lesson at each station. And then alternative teaching is when you have the main group of students and probably the general educator would be up front teaching to the main group of students, and then the specialist will take a smaller group of students off to the side and work on the same lesson or work on tutoring or something like that, but it's more intensive and it's more hands-on and one-on-one, so those students can get the assistance that they need. And then the final one is team teaching, where both teachers stand at the front of the class and deliver instruction equally. They take turns providing the instruction and doing things to help out with the lesson. The next major thing that I talked about was parents and guardians. While we talked about all the collaboration that we'll do with the people inside the school, parents and guardians are so important in this equation. They are a part of your IEP team. They will be there when you make the IEP. They will have a say. They will want to know how the student's doing in school. And then communication with your parents is so important. So as a teacher, I recommend a phone call home twice a month, every 2 weeks, or every week if you want to, an email every once in a while. It doesn't have to be bad. Just shoot them an email saying, hey, your child is doing very well in my class today. I've noticed progress in this area and this area. Or you might want to say, I've noticed that your student is struggling with this. Maybe we can try this at home to work with them. Another way is to have an agenda or a behavior chart or a goal chart for the day. And every day you sign it off. We talk about what goals that we met, maybe what goals we didn't. We talk about how our behavior was that day. And then you sign it as the teacher. You send it home. The parent signs it. So we are communicating through the child. And then you come back to school and you make sure the parent signed it. So that way we know that things are getting communicated to the parents. And then parent-teacher conferences. You're going to want to sit down face-to-face and have these conversations with parents. And that's really the bulk of what I spoke about in this guidebook, is just how to differentiate and accommodate in your classroom without singling anyone out and providing the least restrictive environment and the most supportive environment for your students. I didn't want to give it all away and read it to you word for word, but I hope that reading through this book, you get some ideas out of it. You feel free to take anything that I said, any of my examples, and use them in your future classroom. And if you have any questions for me, I did the research, my references are there. It's mostly just the textbook, it's everything we learned, but please come to me and ask me if you have any questions, and I'd love to hear what you guys thought about it and anything else that you might have to say about it. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to me talk about my work, and I hope you enjoy.